Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard. In this series, we're going to take a look at every aspect of the Death Guard, so whether you're looking to get more out of your army, or you're thinking of joining Nurgle's finest, then there's something here for you. In this episode, I wanted to answer a question I've had a couple of times in the comments, so firstly, thank you to those that have got involved, really does mean a lot to me. The question, broadly speaking, is how do I use this unit, or how do I maneuver this unit in a particular way for this outcome, or against this particular faction? Now, it's very hard to answer that question without all the variables, because depending what you're up against, it really changes the outcome. So instead, I thought I would answer that question broadly with 7 points, blessed, which I wish that I knew when I first started playing. I did start out with the Death Guard, so if that's the case for you, hopefully these points should not only answer that question, but help you broadly with planning out your turns in any given game. So let's dive in and take a look at these 7 points for beginners to get the most out of Death Guard. Now, the first point is probably the most important, especially if your opponent is playing a shooting army. Now, make sure there is enough terrain on the board. Now, boards don't necessarily become so cluttered that units can't move. That would, of course, be broken for certain vehicle-heavy armies. But there should be enough cover on there that there isn't a direct line of sight across the board for the opponent wherever they want to be. Those particular angles should require some amount of movement as you move around the board yourself. For a 1,000-point game, I would expect there to be at least 4 pieces of ruin or area terrain, as well as some additional containers or craters to offer either more obscuring or more forms of cover, depending what you want to agree craters count as. You need to ensure that between you and your opponent, you've determined which of those area terrains, or rather where those area terrains boundaries are. So which areas count as being in the terrain and which count as not being in the terrain. On top of that, it would also be important to determine whether ruins have windows or doors in particular places that allow you to be seen through the wall of the ruin, or whether they are completely solid wall, so even though you are within them, you are obscured because you can't just shoot through the wall. You have to be able to see a model in that unit to be able to shoot at the unit. So determining all those things ahead of the game will give you a better idea of how you should move, rather than moving and then realizing in the game that your opponent can still shoot your unit to death. So make sure there is enough terrain on the board and make sure you understand the keywords surrounding it, particularly obscuring. That leads me on to my next point. Get use out of obscuring. Playing Death Guard, you are going to be a predominantly melee army, particularly at low point costs. You can certainly build a very demon engine heavy list with a lot of shooting, but the majority of Death Guard units have a melee propensity, so an average list is going to be melee focused primarily. Using obscuring effectively and staging your first few turns is something that will come with experience, but starting early will help you get there that bit sooner. Staging can feel almost like wasting a turn, but turn 1 and turn 2 aren't necessarily about killing the opponent, but preparing to get the most out of attempting to kill them in turns 3, 4, and 5. Staging towards objectives is very important because, of course, if you can get on them turn 1, you can start scoring well on the primary turn 2. And if you can score well on the primary turn 2 and turn 3, it puts your opponent in a position where they have to start scoring points. And that may mean, for some armies, that they have to start fighting you on your terms, or they will just lose the game. So utilizing the obscuring and perhaps not necessarily moving up the maximum you could, but forcing the opponent to move in order to get lines of sight to actually get the damage they need to progress their game plan can be just as effective as getting onto objectives in terms of manipulating how your opponent has to play the game. So make sure that firstly, by knowing where you will be obscured, how you can be behind this terrain feature from a good angle, if not all angles, would be a particularly important factor for Death Guard as there is not an awful lot of shooting in the list. Being able to touch into a ruin that has windows or doors where you can shoot out of it, and then perhaps firing a melter and a blight launcher from a 5-man Plague Marine squad might be tempting. But unless the average result is that you kill a unit, which it isn't likely to be the case with just 2 shots, it may be detrimental for you to try and pick up that damage, because you might be opening that unit up to the opponent shooting their whole army back and destroying that squad of Plague Marines, meaning it's not there to hold objectives and score you points on the primary in later turns. So don't necessarily worry about dealing big damage early, even though that is very valuable, unless the average result is that you will get the job done, in which case, fair enough, if you're unlucky, it happens. Third point here is know your secondaries. Now, for me, secondaries occur in the list building stage. Obviously, you only pick your secondaries when you're in the game, you know what you're up against, you know the mission you're playing, but building your list to perform the secondaries that you're most likely to pick is a very important part of list design. I always have a squad of 10 or so Poxwalkers in the list to hold the home objective and spread the sickness on that home objective, as well as screen out that part of my deployment zone. If you've got any long-range firepower, like Playburst Crawlers or perhaps Mephitic Blight Haulers to a lesser extent, again, they can screen out another area of deployment zone. So if you are worried about your opponent striking in, you can prevent them doing that with those units. However, I quite like to leave a gap with those 10 Poxwalkers to allow the opponent to strike in. Generally, that unit has some amount of shooting, though not always. And so if they do decide to pick up a few models, you take away the closest models and make that 9-inch charge suddenly 10, 11, 12 inches, probably more like 10 or 11, and that bit harder for them to make. And of course, when they then fail that charge, they've got to spend a whole nother turn where you can move those Poxwalkers away and just play keep away with their Terminators. If your opponent does commit to something like that, they are then essentially spending 4 times as many points on the unit that they're chasing yours with, and you've got those points committed elsewhere on the battlefield to deal damage to a more important threat of your opponents. But either way round, the idea that that unit was there purely to score part of the primary and that secondary means that any additional value I can get out of it through manipulating the opponent's maneuvers is added bonus. Same goes, I would probably have a squad of 5 Plague Marines in most, if not all, lists, specifically to go and capture the close no man's land objective, because again, they are OBSEC, so they're going to complete the spread the sickness in the turn that they start the action, so my opponent can't interact with it. That gets me 4 victory points in the bag. And again, it's not a massive investment, 105 points, to have on another objective if I can get them in a position where they're obscured from some angles, which means my opponent has to work to get the shots on them. By the time they perhaps have to come forwards to get that shot, they've opened up an angle for me to make a charge. So knowing to play your secondaries with your list will essentially force your opponent to make certain decisions as well, a lot of the time. Secondaries like the Spoiled Grounds are perhaps more difficult at 1,000 points, arguably, just because you're most likely starting out with less units than you would at 2,000 points. But arguably, your opponent has less units themselves to deal with those. So you wouldn't necessarily end up with that much less come the end of the game. I don't think the Spoiled Grounds is a great secondary overall, so I wouldn't necessarily be building a list with the idea being to take that. But certainly Fleeing Vectors is one that you are building your list for. The amount of plague weapons and the amount of attacks you can make with those plague weapons does form a pretty big factor in whether you will be able to kill 7 models each turn. On top of that, your opponent needs to have a reasonable amount of infantry, beasts or swarms in order to be able to kill those models in the quantity you require. But again, having something like Terminators in the list means you need to be aware of Break Their Spirits, being -4 leadership for 1 CP, helping a unit fail morale can score you 3 victory points if you did get at least 1 kill with a plague weapon that turn. So again, knowing how to get those victory points in a pinch can be all the difference between swinging a score in your favour or perhaps laying it on thick and putting the pressure on your opponent. The fourth point here is always go up the middle. Now, there are reasons why you wouldn't. For example, on the map where you deploy in 1/4 of the board with that circle cut out in the middle, you're going to have to move laterally to get to the other objective. Of course, go towards the objective. That's the primary mission. You score points doing that. But otherwise, for the majority of maps, getting to the objectives involves going towards your opponent, and I would always recommend taking that line up the middle. Firstly, it's the shortest distance. For an army that's fairly slow, getting the most out of that movement angle is important. But on top of that, going up the middle gives you a maximum threat range. Because if we imagine, say like the Mephitic Blightwall, it's got 24-inch range on its melters. If it goes up the middle, it's got 24-inch in all directions. Of course, ruins and things might block certain angles, but it can go 24 inches in all directions. Now, in a real-world scenario, it might be preferable to send that Blight Hauler up the flank, try and get round the opponent and strike in at whatever their weak point is in the rear. However, in a game, that's not necessarily a consideration, because the Blight Hauler now only has 24 inches in one direction, which means it can't necessarily see all the board that it would have if it was going up the middle. So again, there are going to be scenarios where that doesn't make sense, but if you're not sure, going up the middle gives you the most flexibility to then pivot and go in whichever direction is the more important direction in a later turn. The next point there is use difficult ground. Now, the Death Guard, of course, are slow in terms of their infantry, but Bubonic Astartes infantry don't take the penalty for difficult ground. So if you are moving and advancing across some difficult ground, you're essentially getting 4-inch extra movement that any other type of Marine, for example, wouldn't get. So, well, not necessarily any type, I don't know every single rule, but I don't think that many of them ignore difficult terrain unless they can fly. So if we're talking about a typical Marine that can move 6-inch and they're advancing across difficult ground, they're going to move 4, and they're only going to get a maximum of another 4, but probably more like another 1 or 2. So they're only going to move 5 or 6 inches altogether. Whereas the Death Guard move their 5, and then they can roll their advance as normal. Let's say we get an average result of 3, you're moving 8 inches. So across difficult ground, not only are you getting the benefit of dense cover most of the time, depending on the rule you set for that area terrain, so you're getting that -1 to hit, bit of extra durability essentially, but on top of that, you're actually faster than most armies when you're crossing difficult terrain, and the fact that you would almost certainly have some kind of symmetrical arrangement for the opponent means that if you can place that terrain in a way that benefits you by not being penalized and doesn't benefit the opponent because they are penalized, that can swing the movement sort of scenario the other way round, depending on the units you're looking to march across it. Do bear in mind, Poxwalkers do still suffer with difficult ground, so you don't want to be moving them across it unless you absolutely have to, because it will probably hold them up for 2 or 3 turns if you do. The last point here is utilize units that make your opponent's turn difficult. Now, this isn't going to be an exhaustive list because there are a wide variety of ways you can use units to make your opponent's turn more difficult, but the key options here for me, the Death Shroud and the Foul Blightspawn both have great Overwatch potential because they have auto-hitting weapons. So you get around the 6s to hit because you just simply don't need to do a hit roll. The Death Shroud, whilst it's only Strength 3 and Strength 3, no AP, 1 damage, it's a good number of hits, and through weight of fire can definitely get rid of light infantry, but may even chip off a model or 2 on some more reasonable infantry like Marines. The Blightspawn hits at Strength 8 if you've gone with the Viscous Death upgrade, which I'd definitely recommend. Hits at Strength 8, can re-roll the number of hits, and it's AP 3, flat 2 damage. So it deals with a wide variety of targets fairly well on the Overwatch, and can be some really significant value for 1 CP. If you had a stratagem for shoot twice, I would probably consider using that on the Blightspawn quite a lot, and the Overwatch is essentially allowing them to shoot again with their full potential. Any other unit in the army, of course, would be hitting on 6s, and that's really going to water down the output. The fact that the Blightspawn doesn't suffer in that way makes the Overwatch stratagem really, really potent. The second and third plague companies both have really good stratagems to make melee armies have a really complex charge phase. The second play company allows you to add 2 to the charge distance for an inexorable model that's been targeted. So that can be great out in a wide position. Maybe your opponent has struck in and you're making that 9-inch charge an 11-inch charge now, which of course is unlikely to work and will allow you to remain perhaps on that objective another turn unmolested. If you do it in the center of the battlefield, it may be the case that your opponent can't charge in without also declaring that unit, and so everything that they might have wanted to charge has now got an additional +2 to the distance. The third play company have the ability to heroically intervene with every unit that is within range of that charge target. So you do need to be quite high and tight. You need to be able to be within 3 of that charged unit and get into engagement range. But on the central objective, if you're stacking everything up on there, it does come up fairly frequently. I haven't found it to be that potent, generally speaking, but when it is usable, it is very effective. Making sure the opponent doesn't get the opportunity to charge 1 for 1 in a trade that might work well for them, and instead has to charge 2 or 3 units, means that even if they do a number on their key target, you've got something to hit them back with and make them pay in their own turn, which again adds to fleeing vectors. If you can make the model flee, the unit flee, or, well, fail morale, or you can get up to 7 models killed, it scores per turn. So you don't need to set up fleeing vectors to score in your own turn if you can make it score in your opponent's. And then the last one here I'll mention, again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but the Blight Spawn, I think, is one of the best value for model units in the game. Not even in the Codex, in the game. 95 points for a great shooting option, but also a fight last and denying fight first and charges, if you take the Revolting Stenchvat relic, just turns the way melee works on its head. If you've ever come up against armies with fight first or fight last effects, then you'll know the potency of them. They really change the dynamic of how charges and melee engagements will work. So having a Blight Spawn there in and around that central engagement where your opponent is going to have to commit something eventually means that you can essentially turn what would be a poor engagement for your infantry squad, or, well, whatever unit it is, into a great engagement because they're getting to smash those guys in the face first, rather than your opponent getting the benefit of the charge and being able to fight first. So overall, they are my 7 blessed points to get the most out of your Death Guard. Hopefully they help and answer the questions raised. If you do have any further questions or anything you think I've missed, please do feel free to add it in the comments. I'll always read those and get back to you. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time in the Underhive.